The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, that peculiar scent of authority and time. The murmur of voices filled the air, low, uncertain, curious. Some people had come for other cases and stayed just to see the young man who dared to represent himself. Jamal Rivers walked down the aisle between the rows of benches, clutching a thin folder that held every document, every note, and every piece of hope he had. His heart pounded, but his stride was steady. He had promised himself he wouldn't let them see fear. The judge, an older man named Harold Whitman, adjusted his glasses and frowned when he saw Jamal approach the defendant's table. Whitman had seen his share of defendants, nervous, angry, defeated, but this one seemed different. Too calm, maybe even defiant. The judge didn't like it. "Mr. Rivers," he said, voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room, "you're aware that representing yourself is not recommended in criminal proceedings of this nature." Jamal met his gaze and nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor, I'm aware." A brief pause. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the bench. "You declined public counsel." "Yes, Your Honor." Whitman sighed, the kind of sigh that spoke of weary superiority. "Well," he muttered, not bothering to lower his voice, "we'll see how long that confidence lasts." A few people in the gallery chuckled under their breath. The court reporter tried not to look up from her machine. Jamal didn't respond. He placed his folder on the table, opened it carefully, and organized his papers by color-coded tabs. His motions were deliberate, almost ritualistic. He could feel every eye on him. The prosecutor's skeptical stare, the judge's impatience, even the bailiff's faint smirk. To them, he was just another arrogant kid, a man who thought watching a few courtroom dramas made him a lawyer. But Jamal had been preparing for this for months. Nights spent at the public library, poring over law books until the janitor flicked the lights. He'd read the Constitution so many times the words echoed in his dreams. He'd studied transcripts, memorized precedents, and rehearsed every argument in front of his bathroom mirror. This wasn't a game for him. It was survival. The prosecutor, a tall woman in her 40s named Karen Ellis, stood from her table and approached the bench. "Your Honor, before we begin, the state would like to note for the record that Mr. Rivers has chosen to proceed pro se. We've advised him of his right to counsel, and we just want to make sure that's clearly acknowledged." The judge nodded. "Duly noted. Mr. Rivers, you understand that if you lose this case, there may be serious consequences. This isn't small claims court. You're facing felony charges." Jamal lifted his chin. "I understand, Your Honor. And I'm ready to proceed." The judge arched an eyebrow, almost amused. "All right then, let's hope your confidence is matched by your legal ability." His tone carried a hint of mockery, the kind that invites laughter, and the courtroom obliged with a few snickers. Jamal didn't blink. He just said quietly, "Not confidence, Your Honor. Preparation." Something in his voice made a few people glance at each other. It wasn't arrogance, it was conviction. The kind that can't be faked. When the bailiff called the court to order and the formal proceedings began, Jamal felt his pulse steady. The sound of the gavel striking the block rang through the air like a drumbeat, sharp, final, absolute. He watched the judge settle into his role, watched the prosecutor glance at her notes. Everything in the room felt choreographed, familiar to them, but to him, it was a battlefield. He noticed how Judge Whitman's lips tightened whenever he spoke, how his eyes flicked toward the gallery as if checking whether the audience shared his skepticism. Jamal could almost hear what they were thinking. He's going to mess up. He's in over his head. But Jamal had grown up hearing worse. Teachers who'd said he'd never finish college. Bosses who'd told him to watch his tone. Strangers who crossed the street when he walked by. None of that broke him. He'd learned to let doubt fuel him, not define him. As the charges were read aloud, he kept his expression composed. Each word, intent to defraud, obstruction, false documentation, felt heavy, but he met every one of them head-on. When the judge asked how he pleaded, Jamal's voice was clear and firm. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The judge scribbled something on his notes. "Very well. Let's see if you can prove it." His tone still carried that same condescension, but Jamal didn't rise to it. He just straightened his papers again, looked directly at the prosecution table, and smiled slightly. He could feel the weight of the courtroom pressing in, the whispers, the judgment, the unspoken assumption that a young black man standing alone in front of a white judge didn't stand a chance. But Jamal wasn't there to play by their expectations. He was there to rewrite them. And as the first witness was called, a quiet resolve settled over him. He'd let them laugh. He'd let them doubt. But by the end of this trial, they would remember his name, not as a defendant, but as the man who stood up, spoke truth, and made the system listen. When the prosecutor, Karen Ellis, rose from her chair, the room straightened with her. She carried an air of authority, her tone polished and confident, her words sharp as a blade. She began with her opening statement, rehearsed, crisp, and deliberately aimed to paint Jamal as reckless, manipulative, and dishonest. Each sentence was crafted to make him seem small. The defendant, she said, gesturing toward Jamal, knowingly falsified documentation to obtain government contracts. This wasn't a mistake, Your Honor. This was deliberate deception. Her voice rang through the courtroom with theatrical precision. She spoke as though her words were already truth carved in stone. Jamal watched her carefully. He didn't interrupt, didn't fidget. His face remained calm, but inside, he was assembling pieces, marking weak points like a chess player planning 5 moves ahead. When she submitted a stack of documents into evidence, Jamal quietly noted the serial numbers at the top. One of them didn't match what had been disclosed in discovery. The judge nodded along, occasionally glancing at Jamal as though expecting confusion or panic. None came. Jamal just wrote something down, turned a page, and waited. When it was finally his turn, he stood slowly, adjusting his tie and straightening his notes. The silence that followed was heavy, curious. Everyone was waiting to see him stumble, to see the overconfident amateur meet reality. Your Honor, Jamal began, his voice smooth but firm, the prosecution is correct about one thing, paperwork was filed. But what they've failed to mention is that those documents were not filed by me. The prosecutor blinked, momentarily thrown off. Jamal continued, if the court would allow, he said, holding up a copy of a signature page, I'd like to compare Exhibit C from the prosecution with a certified copy obtained from the contracting office. Judge Whitman frowned but gestured for the bailiff to take the papers. Proceed, he said cautiously. When the judge placed the 2 signatures side by side, the difference was clear. The prosecution's version bore a shaky, uneven scrawl, the other, steady and consistent with Jamal's verified signature. The gallery began whispering. Karen's tone wavered for the first time. There may have been a clerical. Jamal cut in politely but firmly. A clerical error that also happens to misplace $42,000 in deposits to a private account that doesn't belong to me. The room stilled. The judge's pen stopped mid-tap. Jamal turned toward the bench. Your Honor, I'd like to submit additional evidence, phone logs and emails that show communication between the contracting officer and another party using my credentials. He paused, eyes locked on the judge. That party, as records indicate, is an employee of the same office that processed the falsified document. There was no arrogance in his tone, only precision. Every word landed with weight. Karen tried to object, claiming the new evidence was inadmissible, but Jamal was ready. He cited Brady v. Maryland, explaining in measured cadence that the prosecution had an obligation to disclose exculpatory evidence, evidence favorable to the defense, and that withholding such information violated constitutional due process. He spoke the citation as though he'd spent years in court, his confidence neither forced nor theatrical. Judge Whitman blinked, caught off guard. You're familiar with Brady? Yes, Your Honor, Jamal replied. As well as Miranda v. Arizona, Giglio v. United States, and the Federal Rules of Evidence, Rule 401 through 403, if necessary. For a moment, the courtroom was utterly silent. The spectators leaned forward, even the stenographer slowed her typing just to watch. The same young man the judge had mocked for playing lawyer was now quoting landmark cases with surgical precision, and winning ground, inch by inch. Karen tried to recover, shifting her stance. Mr. Rivers, this isn't a law school lecture. The facts are simple. No, ma'am, Jamal interrupted calmly, the facts are exactly what you've chosen to ignore. And I'd like the jury, if there were one, to know that truth matters more than presentation. He turned toward the judge. Since we don't have a jury, I trust the court sees the same inconsistencies I do. Judge Whitman didn't reply right away. He was studying Jamal now, not as a nuisance or a fool, but as something unexpected, a man who refused to be underestimated. Jamal then projected a series of emails, obtained through a lawful discovery request. The timestamps showed communication between the real culprit and the contracting officer, long after Jamal's alleged involvement had ended. When he pointed out how the metadata contradicted the prosecutor's timeline, a murmur rippled through the gallery again. Karen objected, citing lack of authentication. Jamal immediately countered. The emails were verified using a chain of custody log provided by your own office, ma'am. Page 5 of your own evidence binder. Her face flushed. She flipped the binder open, searching, and there it was. Page 5. The seal. Her own initials. The judge's eyebrows rose. Is that accurate, Ms. Ellis? Karen hesitated. It appears so, Your Honor. The courtroom erupted into low whispers again. The judge rapped his gavel once. Order. But even he couldn't hide the shift in the air. Jamal turned slightly, speaking evenly. Your Honor, I believe the state's case rests on a misunderstanding of who actually committed this act. I'll demonstrate in full during cross-examination, but I think the pattern is clear. They built a case around assumption, not evidence. Then, for the first time, Judge Whitman didn't look dismissive. His tone softened, measured. Proceed, Mr. Rivers. As Jamal sat down, he exhaled quietly. He caught a few eyes in the audience, people who had laughed earlier, now looking at him with something new, respect. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was proving something bigger, that knowledge, preparation, and courage could turn a room full of skeptics into witnesses of their own bias. The courtroom was still as the afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, throwing thin bands of gold across the polished wooden floor. Hours had passed since Jamal had first stood to speak, yet no one seemed tired. Even the judge, who had leaned on one hand for most of the morning, now sat upright and attentive. The evidence Jamal presented had changed everything. The once certain tone of the prosecution had withered into hesitation, and every new fact he revealed tightened the thread of doubt around their case. When he stood again for closing statements, he didn't raise his voice or stride dramatically across the floor like attorneys in movies. He simply walked to the center of the room, folded his hands, and looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, he began, when I first walked into this courtroom, I could feel what everyone else was thinking. That I didn't belong here. That I didn't know what I was doing. His tone wasn't bitter, just steady, factual. And I understand that. It's easy to assume that someone who looks like me, who doesn't wear $1,000 suit or carry a law degree, must be lost. But the truth is, I came here today with one goal, to show that truth doesn't depend on appearances. The judge didn't interrupt. The gallery was silent. Even Karen Ellis, the prosecutor, kept her eyes on the table in front of her, her pen unmoving. Jamal continued, walking slowly toward the evidence board that had once been filled with papers accusing him. Now, half of them were marked invalid in red ink. The documents they presented were falsified. The emails they relied on were incomplete. And the money trail they claimed led to me, he tapped the board lightly, actually points somewhere else entirely. I didn't have access to a law library, or an investigator, or a team of clerks. What I had was the truth, and the determination to prove it. He paused, scanning the room. My entire life, people have told me what I couldn't do. What I shouldn't try, but sometimes, he said softly, you have to stand up in a room full of people waiting for you to fail, and make them listen. When he finished, there was a long moment where no one moved. The judge cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable with the emotion that hung in the air. Thank you, Mr. Rivers, he said quietly. Ms. Ellis, would you like to respond? Karen rose hesitantly. Her confidence was gone. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, sounded uncertain. Your Honor, the state concedes that there appear to be discrepancies in the evidence presented. In light of Mr. Rivers' findings, and the chain of custody concerns he's identified, we move to dismiss the charges. The gallery erupted. People gasped, murmured, turned to one another. The judge raised his hand for silence, but even he looked surprised. He shuffled his papers, then lifted his gaze toward Jamal. Mr. Rivers, you've heard the state's motion. This court hereby grants it. The case is dismissed. The gavel struck wood. A single, heavy sound that echoed through the room like a thunderclap. Jamal closed his eyes for a moment, not out of triumph but sheer relief. The months of fear, study, exhaustion, and isolation melted into that single sound. When he opened his eyes, Judge Whitman was looking at him differently, not as a curiosity or a nuisance, but as a man who had earned his respect. "Mr. Rivers," the judge said after a pause, "I may owe you an apology. I underestimated you." Jamal gave a small nod. "That's all right, Your Honor. People often do." For the first time, the judge smiled faintly. "If you ever decide to take the bar exam, I think you might surprise more than just this courtroom." Laughter rippled through the spectators, not mocking this time, but warm, genuine. Karen Ellis even stepped forward, extending her hand. "You were extraordinary in there," she admitted. "I can't remember the last time I lost a case and still felt it was fair." Jamal shook her hand, polite but modest. "You did your job," he said. "I just had to do mine." Outside, the late afternoon air felt different, lighter, brighter somehow. Reporters who had been waiting by the courthouse steps swarmed him with microphones, shouting questions. "How did you learn the law? Did you expect to win? What's next for you?" Jamal smiled, exhaustion softening his expression. "I didn't expect to win," he said honestly. "I just expected to be heard." The cameras flashed as he continued, "Justice shouldn't belong only to those who can afford it. It should belong to everyone who's willing to stand up for it." The reporters pressed closer, but he raised a hand, signaling he'd said enough. He stepped down the courthouse steps slowly, each one a little easier than the last. Somewhere in the crowd, an older man called out, "You showed them, son." Jamal turned, smiled faintly, and nodded in thanks. He reached the bottom of the steps and paused. For the first time in months, he had nowhere he had to be, no hearings, no paperwork, no looming threats. Just freedom. He looked back once at the courthouse, its white columns glowing in the dying light, and then forward, toward the street stretching out before him. He didn't know exactly what came next. Law school, maybe, or helping others who couldn't afford representation. But he knew this much. He'd walked into that courtroom as a man everyone doubted, and walked out as a man no one would ever forget.